The smell of burning wood and charred grease hung in the air. Flames consumed the once cozy diner, their fiery tongues licking the night sky. The sign above the door, Joe's Haven, crashed to the ground, engulfed in flames. A group of thugs stood nearby, laughing and cheering, bottles of gasoline still clutched in their hands. "That'll teach the old man," sneered the leader, a wiry figure with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck. His accomplices nodded, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of destruction. Unbeknownst to them, a figure stood in the shadows, watching. His knuckles were white around a small medallion he clutched tightly, a keepsake from a time long gone. Joe, the diner's owner, had witnessed the entire scene. The grief etched on his weathered face was soon replaced by something colder, harder. They didn't know who he was, but they were about to find out. The bell above the door jingled softly as I wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that morning. It was a sound I'd grown to love over the years. A little melody that signaled the arrival of a friend, a stranger, or sometimes just the wind pushing its way in from the street. Joe's Haven had been my sanctuary for 3 decades. A place where the smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint crackle of old jazz records spinning on the turntable in the corner. It was a simple life, but it was mine. I glanced up as Lisa bustled past, her arms loaded with plates of pancakes and eggs. She was a good kid, bright-eyed and full of dreams, working her way through community college one shift at a time. She reminded me of Anna in some ways. Same quick smile, same determination. I shook my head, pushing the thought away. Anna had been gone for 15 years now, but sometimes her memory still caught me off guard, like a sudden gust of wind on a still day. "Order up, Joe," Lisa called over her shoulder, sliding the plates onto the counter with practiced ease. I nodded, grabbing the coffee pot and making my way over to Hank's usual booth by the window. He was already there, his grizzled face buried in a newspaper, a half-empty mug of coffee in front of him. Hank was a regular, a trucker who rolled into town every Thursday like clockwork. He didn't say much, but he didn't need to. We had an understanding. "Morning, Hank," I said, refilling his mug. He grunted in response, not looking up from the paper. I chuckled under my breath. Some things never changed. The diner was quiet this morning, the kind of quiet that felt like a deep breath before a storm. The usual crowd was sparse. Just Hank, a couple of locals nursing their coffees, and a young family in the corner booth. I didn't mind the quiet. It gave me time to think, to plan. There was always something that needed fixing. A leaky faucet, a flickering light, a new batch of pies to bake. I liked keeping busy. It kept the memories at bay. I was just about to head back to the kitchen when the door jingled again. This time, it wasn't the wind. Sheriff Carter stepped inside, his hat in his hands and a grim look on his face. My stomach tightened. Carter wasn't one for casual visits, not this early in the morning. "Joe?" he said, nodding at me as he approached the counter. "Got a minute?" "For you?" "Always," I replied, though the unease in my gut was growing. I gestured to the stool in front of me, and he sat down heavily, his eyes scanning the room like he was looking for something. Or someone. "What's on your mind, Carter?" I asked, pouring him a cup of coffee without waiting for him to ask. He took a sip, his hand steady, but his expression troubled. "It's Snake," he said finally, his voice low. "He's been making the rounds again, shaking down businesses, demanding protection money. You heard about the hardware store, right?" I nodded, my jaw tightening. I'd heard. Old man Jenkins had come in just yesterday, his hands shaking, as he told me about the gang's visit. They'd taken everything: cash, tools, even the spare change from the register. Jenkins had looked defeated, like a man who'd lost more than just his money. He'd lost his dignity. I told him no. I said, my voice firm. "This place is built on integrity. I won't let some two-bit thug take that away from me." Carter sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I know, Joe. And I admire your guts. But Snake's not playing around. He's dangerous. If he comes here, let him come. I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. I've dealt with worse. Carter studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to see past the mask I'd worn for so long. You're not just some diner owner, are you, Joe? He asked quietly. There's something about you. Something you're not telling me. I looked away, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. Carter was a good man, a friend, but there were some things I couldn't share. Some things I'd buried so deep I wasn't sure I could dig them up again. Let's just say I've seen my share of trouble, I said finally, my voice softer now. And I'm not afraid of Snake. Carter didn't press further, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He finished his coffee in silence, then stood, clapping me on the shoulder as he turned to leave. Be careful, Joe, he said, his voice heavy with warning. Snake's not the kind of guy you want to cross. I watched him go, the bell above the door jingling softly as it swung shut behind him. For a moment, the diner was quiet again. The only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. But the calm didn't last. The door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that made the windows rattle. I turned, my heart pounding, as three men strode inside. They were young, cocky, dressed in leather jackets and jeans, their eyes hard and their smiles cruel. I recognized them instantly. Snake's lackeys. The diner fell silent, the air thick with tension. Even Hank looked up from his newspaper, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Lisa froze in the doorway to the kitchen, her face pale. The leader of the group, a wiry guy with a snake tattoo coiled around his neck, sauntered up to the counter, his hands in his pockets and a smirk on his face. Joe, he said, his voice dripping with false cheer. Long time no see. I didn't respond. My eyes locked on his. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter, his smirk widening. Snake sent us, he said, his tone casual, like we were old friends catching up. He wanted to remind you of his offer. You know, for your protection. I clenched my fists under the counter, my jaw tightening. I don't need his protection, I said, my voice steady despite the anger boiling inside me. The guy's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of irritation. See, that's the thing, Joe, he said, his voice hardening. It's not really up to you. Snake's got a reputation to maintain. And if you don't play ball, he trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air. I didn't flinch. Tell Snake he can go to hell, I said, my voice low and cold. The guy's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might swing at me. But then he straightened, his smirk returning as he backed away from the counter. Your funeral, old man, he said, his tone light, but his eyes deadly. We'll be seeing you. With that, they turned and left, the door slamming shut behind them. The diner was silent for a long moment, the tension slowly easing as the sound of their footsteps faded away. Lisa was the first to speak, her voice trembling. Joe, what are we going to do? I looked at her, then at Hank, who was watching me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Even the young family in the corner booth was staring, their faces pale with fear. We're going to keep doing what we've always done, I said, my voice firm. This is Joe's haven, and no one, not Snake, not anyone, is going to take that away from us. But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, the calm before the storm. And deep down, I knew that the life I'd built, the peace I'd fought so hard to find, was about to be tested in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The rest of the day passed in a tense blur. The usual rhythm of the diner, the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, felt muted, like the world was holding its breath. Lisa moved through her tasks with a nervous energy, her eyes darting to the door every time the bell jingled. Hank stayed longer than usual, nursing his coffee and keeping a watchful eye on the street outside. Even the regulars seemed quieter, their usual banter replaced by hushed whispers and worried glances. I tried to keep things normal, to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. But the truth was, I could feel the storm brewing on the horizon. Dark and heavy and inevitable. Snake's boys had made their point, and they'd made it clear. This wasn't over. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon and the diner emptied out, I was exhausted. Not just from the day's work, but from the weight of what was coming. I locked the door behind the last customer, flipping the sign to closed, and leaning against the frame for a moment. My eyes closed. "Joe?" Lisa's voice was soft, hesitant. I turned to see her standing by the counter, her apron in her hands and a worried look on her face. "Are you okay?" I forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "I'm fine, kid. Just tired. You should head home. Get some rest." She hesitated, like she wanted to say more. But then she nodded, grabbing her coat from the hook by the door. "Okay, but be careful, Joe. Those guys, they're not messing around." "I know," I said, my voice gentle. "I'll be fine. Now go on. Get out of here." She left with one last worried glance, the bell jingling softly as the door closed behind her. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading into the night. Then I turned and made my way to the back of the diner, where the small office was tucked away behind the kitchen. The office was a mess, as usual. Papers piled high on the desk, receipts spilling out of drawers, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey sitting on the shelf. I grabbed the bottle and poured myself a drink, the amber liquid catching the dim light as I raised the glass to my lips. The whiskey burned going down, but it did little to ease the tension coiled in my chest. I sat down at the desk, my eyes drifting to the old photo frame sitting on the corner. It was a picture of Anna, taken not long before she died. She was smiling, her eyes bright and full of life, her hair catching the sunlight. I reached out, my fingers brushing the edge of the frame, and for a moment, I could almost hear her voice, soft and warm and full of love. "What would you do, Anna?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. "What would you tell me to do?" But there was no answer, just the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a car passing by outside. I sighed, leaning back in my chair and closing my eyes. The memories were always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness to rise up and pull me under. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in thought, but eventually, the sound of breaking glass jolted me back to the present. My eyes snapped open, my body tensing as I listened. For a moment, there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the night. Then it came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I was on my feet in an instant, my heart pounding as I moved to the door. The office was at the back of the diner, separated from the main room by a narrow hallway. I crept down the hall, my senses on high alert, my hand instinctively reaching for the baseball bat I kept propped against the wall. The diner was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. I could see the broken glass scattered near the front door, the jagged edges glittering in the dim light. And then I saw them, 3 figures moving through the shadows, their faces obscured by hoods and masks. My grip tightened on the bat as I stepped into the room, my voice low and steady. "Get out!" The figures froze, their heads snapping toward me. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of them laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Or what, old man?" he sneered, stepping into the light. It was the same guy from earlier, the one with the snake tattoo. His eyes gleamed with malice as he pulled a knife from his pocket, the blade catching the light. "You gonna take us all on with that bat?" I didn't respond, my eyes flicking between the 3 of them. They were young, cocky, and clearly thought they had the upper hand. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Not really. The guy with the knife lunged first, his movements quick but sloppy. I sidestepped easily, bringing the bat down hard on his wrist. He cried out, the knife clattering to the floor as he stumbled back, clutching his arm. The other two hesitated, their confidence wavering for the first time. I said, "Get out!" I repeated, my voice colder now, harder. "This is your last chance." But they didn't listen. The second guy came at me with a wild swing, his fist aimed at my face. I ducked, driving the bat into his stomach with enough force to knock the wind out of him. He doubled over, gasping for air, and I followed up with a sharp blow to the back of his head, sending him sprawling to the floor. The third guy was smarter. He hung back, his eyes darting between me and his fallen friends. For a moment, I thought he might run. But then he reached into his jacket, pulling out a gun and leveling it at me. My heart stopped, my grip on the bat tightening as I stared down the barrel of the gun. The guy's hand was shaking, his eyes wide with fear and adrenaline. He was scared enough to pull the trigger. "Drop it," he said, his voice trembling. "Drop the bat or I'll shoot." I hesitated, my mind racing. I could see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty. He didn't want to do this, but fear made people unpredictable, and I couldn't take the risk. Slowly, I lowered the bat, letting it clatter to the floor. The guy's shoulders relaxed slightly, his grip on the gun loosening. It was the opening I needed. I moved fast, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat. My hand shot out, grabbing his wrist and twisting it hard. He cried out, the gun falling from his hand as I drove my knee into his stomach, sending him crumpling to the floor. For a moment, the diner was silent. The only sound the ragged breathing of the three intruders as they lay on the floor, groaning in pain. I stood over them, my chest heaving, my hands clenched into fists. "Get up," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "And get out. If I ever see you again, you won't walk away." They didn't need to be told twice. The guy with the snake tattoo was the first to scramble to his feet, his face pale as he helped his friends up. They stumbled toward the door, their movements clumsy and hurried, their bravado completely shattered. I watched them go, my heart still pounding, my body tense. The door slammed shut behind them, the bell jingling faintly as it swung back and forth. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the broken glass and the overturned chairs, the weight of what had just happened settling over me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Snake wasn't the kind of guy who took no for an answer, and now he knew I wasn't going to back down. This was just the beginning. I turned and made my way back to the office, my steps heavy. The photo of Anna was still sitting on the desk, her smile as warm and reassuring as ever. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the edge of the frame. "I'm sorry, Anna," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I tried to leave it all behind, but I don't think I can anymore." I set the photo down gently, then reached for the bottom drawer of the desk. It was locked, but I had the key. Inside was a small, nondescript box. I opened it, my hands trembling slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside was a gun, a sleek black pistol that felt familiar in my hand, even after all these years. And next to it, a faded dog tag with a name etched into the metal, Sergeant Joseph Carver. I stared at it for a long time, the memories flooding back. Memories I'd tried so hard to bury, but they were there, waiting, like a storm on the horizon. The spark had been lit, and now it was only a matter of time before it ignited. The morning sun rose over the smoldering ruins of Joe's Haven, casting a pale, sickly light over the charred remains of what had once been my life's work. I sat on the steps, my hands resting on my knees, staring at the blackened skeleton of the diner. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and ash, and the faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance. A small crowd had gathered, Locals, regulars, people who had called this place their second home. They stood in silence, their faces etched with shock and sorrow. Lisa approached cautiously, her footsteps crunching on the debris-strewn ground. Her eyes were red and puffy, her face pale. She looked like she hadn't slept, and I didn't blame her. None of us had. "Joe," she said softly, her voice trembling. "What are you going to do?" I didn't answer right away. My gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sun was slowly climbing into the sky. The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. What was I going to do? Rebuild? Start over? The thought felt hollow, like trying to fill a bottomless pit with sand. "I'll rebuild," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. It was the answer she wanted to hear, the one that offered some semblance of hope. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't enough. Rebuilding the diner wouldn't fix what had been broken. It wouldn't bring back the sense of peace I'd worked so hard to create. And it wouldn't stop Snake. Lisa nodded, though her eyes were still filled with doubt. She sat down beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long time, we just sat there in silence, watching as the fire department finished their work and the crowd slowly dispersed. Eventually, Lisa stood, brushing the ash from her jeans. "I'll be at my mom's if you need me," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just call me, okay?" I nodded, watching as she walked away. Her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. When she was gone, I stood and made my way into the ruins of the diner, my boots crunching on the broken glass and charred wood. The destruction was overwhelming. The walls were blackened and crumbling, the furniture reduced to ash and twisted metal. The counter where I'd served countless cups of coffee was now a pile of rubble, and the old jazz records that had once filled the air with music were nothing but melted plastic. It was like walking through a graveyard, every step a reminder of what had been lost. But amidst the devastation, something caught my eye. A glint of metal buried beneath a pile of debris. I knelt, brushing aside the ash and broken wood, and pulled out an old metal box. It was dented and scorched, but still intact. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized it. I hadn't seen this box in years, hadn't even thought about it. But now, holding it in my hands, it felt like a sign. I sat down on what was left of the floor, the box resting in my lap. My fingers trembled as I pried it open, the hinges stiff with age. Inside were relics of a life I'd tried to forget. My dog, tags, tarnished, but still legible. A combat knife, its blade sharp and deadly, and a black notebook, its pages filled with names and numbers written in my own hand. I stared at the contents of the box, my chest tight with emotion. These were the remnants of Joseph Carver, the man I'd been before Joe Smith, the man I'd buried along with Anna. But now, as I held these items in my hands, it felt like he was stirring, waking from a long sleep. I opened the notebook, flipping through the pages. The names and numbers were familiar, though I hadn't thought about them in years. They were contacts, people I'd worked with, people who owed me favors, people who could help me now. One name in particular stood out: Marcus Hale, a former intelligence officer who had been a close friend and ally during my time in Delta Force. If anyone could help me, it was him. I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen. It had been years since I'd spoken to Marcus, and I wasn't even sure if this number still worked. But I had to try. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hale." "Marcus," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "It's Joe. Joseph Carver." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Marcus let out a low whistle. "Joe. Damn, it's been a long time. I thought you were dead." "Not yet," I said, my tone grim. "But I need your help." I told him everything, about the diner, about Snake, about the fire. Marcus listened in silence, his breathing steady and calm. When I finished, he let out a sigh. "You're in deep, Joe," he said finally. "Snake's not just some small-time thug. He's connected. Drugs, arms, human trafficking, the whole 9 yards. You're not just dealing with a gang. You're dealing with a network." I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening. I don't care how big he is. He burned down my diner. He threatened my people. I'm not going to let him get away with it. Marcus was silent for a moment. Then he chuckled softly. Same old Joe, always charging headfirst into trouble. "All right, I'll help you. But you're going to need more than just me. You're going to need a plan." "I've got a plan," I said, my voice steady. "But I need information. Everything you've got on Snake. His crew, his operations, his hideouts. I need to know how to hit him where it hurts." "I'll see what I can dig up," Marcus said. "But Joe, be careful. This isn't like the old days. You're not a soldier anymore." "Maybe not," I said, my eyes narrowing as I stared at the ruins of the diner. "But I'm not just a diner owner either." By the time the sun dipped, below the horizon, Marcus had come through. My phone buzzed with a series of messages. Files, photos, maps, and detailed notes on Snake's operations. I sat in the back of my pickup truck, parked a few blocks away from the diner's remains, scrolling through the information with a growing sense of dread. Snake's reach was far wider than I'd imagined. His gang wasn't just a local nuisance. They were part of a sprawling criminal network that stretched across state lines. Drug trafficking, arms deals, human smuggling. They were into everything. And Snake was at the center of it all. I clenched my jaw as I read through the details. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about stopping something much bigger. Something that had been festering in the shadows for far too long. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. I scrolled through the contacts in the black notebook, my fingers pausing on a name I hadn't thought about in years. Reyes. Javier. Reyes had been my spotter back in Delta Force, a man with a sharp mind and an even sharper aim. If anyone could help me take down Snake, it was him. I dialed the number, my heart pounding as the phone rang. After a few seconds, a gruff voice answered. "Reyes." "Javier," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "It's Joe. Joe Carver." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought he might hang up. Then he let out a low laugh. "Carver, damn, I thought you were dead. Or retired. Or both." "Not dead," I said, a faint smile tugging at my lips. "And not retired anymore. I need your help." I filled him in on the situation, my voice low and urgent. Reyes listened in silence, his breathing steady on the other end of the line. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "You always did know how to pick a fight, Carver," he said. "All right, I'm in. But this isn't going to be easy. Snake's got resources, manpower, and no shortage of firepower. We're going to need a plan." "I've got a plan," I said, my eyes narrowing as I stared at the map Marcus had sent me. "But we're going to need more than just the two of us. Who else can we trust?" Reyes was silent for a moment. Then he chuckled. "I know a guy. Ex-Marine. Runs a private security outfit now. He's good. Real good. And he owes me a favor. Get him," I said. "We're going to need all the help we can get." Mo. The time I hung up, the first stars were beginning to appear in the night sky. I leaned back against the truck, my mind racing as I pieced together the plan. Snake's operations were spread out, but there was one place that stood out. A warehouse on the outskirts of town that served as his main hub. If we could hit it hard and fast, we could cripple his network and draw him out into the open. But first, I needed to see it for myself. The warehouse was a sprawling, nondescript building tucked away in an industrial park on the edge of town. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, and the parking lot was filled with trucks and vans. I parked my truck a few blocks away and approached on foot. sticking to the shadows as I circled the perimeter. The place was heavily guarded. I counted at least a dozen men patrolling the grounds, their movements sharp and disciplined. These weren't just thugs, they were professionals. Snake had clearly invested in his security. I crouched behind a stack of pallets, my eyes scanning the area. There were cameras mounted on the corners of the building, their red lights blinking ominously in the dark. Getting inside wasn't going to be easy, but I wasn't planning on going in blind. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos, making note of the guards' patrol routes and the locations of the cameras. Then I slipped back into the shadows, my mind already working through the logistics of the operation. By the time I returned to my truck, I had a rough outline of the plan. We'd hit the warehouse at night, when most of Snake's crew would be inside. Reyes and his contact would handle the perimeter guards, while I went in through the back. Once inside, we'd plant explosives at key points and take out as many of Snake's men as we could. The goal wasn't just to destroy the warehouse, it was to send a message. But as I drove back to town, a sense of unease settled over me. This wasn't just another mission. This was personal. And personal missions had a way of going sideways. The next morning, I met Reyes and his contact at a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. Reyes was exactly as I remembered him. Tall, lean, with a sharp jawline and eyes that missed nothing. His contact, a burly ex-Marine named Mac, was built like a tank, with a shaved head and a no-nonsense demeanor. We spent the day going over the plan, mapping out every detail and running through every possible scenario. Reyes and Mac were professionals, and their expertise was invaluable. But even with their help, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. "You sure about this, Carver?" Reyes asked as we packed up our gear that evening. "Once we go in, there's no turning back." I looked at him, my jaw tight. "I'm sure. Snake burned down my diner. He threatened my people. He's not going to get away with it." Reyes nodded, his expression grim. "All right, let's do this." That night, we moved like shadows through the industrial park, our movements silent and precise. Reyes and Mac took out the perimeter guards with ruthless efficiency, their knives flashing in the dark. I slipped in through the back door, my combat knife in one hand and a silenced pistol in the other. The inside of the warehouse was a maze of crates and pallets, the air thick with the smell of oil and sweat. I moved quickly, my senses on high alert as I planted explosives at key points. The sound of voices echoed through the building, and I could hear the faint hum of machinery in the distance. But as I reached the center of the warehouse, I froze. There, sitting on a crate in the middle of the room, was Snake. He was alone, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Carver," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really think you can take me down? You're just one man." I stepped into the light, my eyes locked on his. "I'm not just one man," I said, my voice cold. "And this isn't just about you." Snake's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Then he reached for the gun at his side, but he was too slow. I fired twice, the silenced shots echoing through the warehouse. Snake crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. I stood over him, my chest heaving, my hands steady. "This is for Joe's Haven," I said, my voice low and deadly. Then I turned and ran, the sound of the explosives detonating behind me as the warehouse erupted in flames. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you feel alive in the worst way. I stood in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, my breath visible in the frosty air, watching as Tank, one of Snake's lieutenants, barked orders at his men. He was a mountain of a man, with a shaved head and a neck thicker than a tree trunk. His reputation for brutality was well earned, and he was one of Snake's most trusted enforcers. If I was going to dismantle Snake's operation, Tank was the perfect place to start. I'd been tailing him for days, learning his routines, his habits, his weaknesses. He was predictable, which made him vulnerable. Tonight, he'd parked his car, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows, outside the warehouse, where the gang stored stolen goods. It was a fortress, but every fortress had its cracks. As Tank and his men disappeared inside, I moved. I slipped through the darkness like a ghost, my movements silent and precise. I reached the SUV and crouched beside it, pulling a small toolkit from my jacket. It didn't take long to sabotage the car. A few cuts to the fuel line, a loosened battery cable, and a tracking device hidden in the wheel well. By the time I was done, the SUV was a ticking time bomb. I retreated to the shadows and waited. It didn't take long. Less than an hour later, Tank emerged from the warehouse, his men trailing behind him. He climbed into the SUV, slammed the door, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. He tried again, but the result was the same. Cursing, he got out and kicked the tire, his face red with anger. "Piece of junk!" he roared, his voice echoing through the empty lot. "Someone get me a ride!" His men scrambled to obey, but I was already moving. I followed Tank as he stormed off on foot, his massive frame silhouetted against the dim streetlights. He was heading toward the industrial district, a maze of empty buildings and dark alleys. It was the perfect place for an ambush. I stayed close, my footsteps silent, my heart steady. When he turned down a narrow alley, I made my move. I stepped out of the shadows, my combat knife in hand, and slammed the hilt into the back of his head. He staggered, dazed, and I drove my knee into his stomach, forcing the air from his lungs. He collapsed to the ground, groaning, and I was on him in an instant, pinning him with my weight. Who the hell are you?" he gasped, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't answer. Instead, I pulled a zip tie from my pocket and secured his hands behind his back. Then I gagged him and dragged him deeper into the alley, where the shadows would hide us from prying eyes. "You're going to tell me everything I want to know," I said, my voice low and cold. "And if you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." Tank's eyes widened, but he didn't resist. He knew he was outmatched. Over the next hour, I extracted every piece of information I could. Names, locations, plans. By the time I was done, I had enough evidence to bring down half of Snake's operation. I left Tank tied up in the alley, a note pinned to his chest for the authorities to find. It was a message, not just for him, but for Snake and the rest of the gang. Someone was coming for them, and they wouldn't see me coming. The next few days were a blur of action and adrenaline. I hit Snake's operation hard and fast, dismantling it piece by piece. I intercepted a drug shipment at the docks, sabotaging the cargo and leaving the dealers tied up for the police. I infiltrated a weapons deal in an abandoned factory, taking out the buyers and sellers before they even knew what hit them. Each time, I left behind a cryptic warning, a single playing card, the ace of spades, with the words, "Justice is coming," scrawled on the back. The gang was rattled. I could see it in their movements, hear it in their voices when I listened in on their conversations. They were scared, and they had every right to be. But Snake wasn't going down without a fight. One night, as I was preparing for my next move, my phone buzzed. It was Lisa. My heart sank as I answered. "Joe," she said, her voice trembling. Someone vandalized my car. They slashed the tires, broke the windows. There was a note. It said, "Stay out of this, or next time it'll be worse." I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her fear. "But Joe, what's going on? What are you mixed up in?" I hesitated, my mind racing. I didn't want to drag her into this, but I couldn't lie to her either. "It's complicated," I said finally, "but I'm going to make it right. Just stay safe, okay? Don't go anywhere alone. And if you see anything suspicious, call the police." She was silent for a moment, then she sighed. "Okay, just be careful, Joe." I hung up, my chest tight with guilt. This was exactly what I'd been trying to avoid. collateral damage. But Snake had made it personal, and I couldn't afford to hold back anymore. The next morning, I got another call. This time, it was Sheriff Carter. "Joe," he said, his voice grim. "My house. Someone firebombed it last night. I wasn't home, but they left a message. Back off, or next time you won't be so lucky." I closed my eyes, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles turned white. Snake was escalating, and he was targeting the people I cared about. I couldn't let this continue. "I'm sorry, Carter," I said, my voice low. "This is my fault, but I'm going to end it. I promise." Carter was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. "Just be careful, Joe. Snake's not someone you want to mess with." "Neither am I said, my tone cold. As I prepared for the next phase of my mission, memories of my Delta Force days resurfaced. I thought about my unit, the men I'd fought alongside, the sacrifices we'd made. I thought about the mission that had driven me to leave, the one that had gone so catastrophically wrong. I'd walked away from that life, vowing never to look back. But now, as I stared at the photo of Anna on my desk, I realized I couldn't run anymore. This wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't even just about justice. It was about protecting the people I cared about, the people who couldn't protect themselves. And if that meant embracing the man I used to be, the soldier, the operative, the killer, then so be it. I picked up the black notebook, flipping through the pages until I found the name I was looking for. It was time to call in another favor. The name in the notebook was Elena Vasquez. She wasn't a soldier or a mercenary. She was a hacker, one of the best I'd ever known. We'd crossed paths during my Delta Force days, and she'd saved my team's ass more than once. If anyone could help me infiltrate Snake's digital operations, it was her. I dialed her number, my fingers trembling slightly. It had been years since we'd spoken, and I wasn't sure if she'd even answer. But after a few rings, her voice came through the line. Sharp, confident, and unmistakably Elena. "This had better be important," she said, her tone laced with irritation. "I'm in the middle of something." "Elena," I said, my voice steady. "It's Joe. Joe Carver." There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "Carver, I thought you were dead. Or retired. Or both." "Not dead," I said, a faint smile tugging at my lips. "And not retired anymore. I need your help." I filled her in on the situation, my voice low and urgent. Elena listened in silence, her breathing steady on the other end of the line. When I finished, she let out a low whistle. "You always did know how to pick a fight, Carver," she said. "All right, I'm in. But this isn't going to be easy. Snake's got layers of security, and his people aren't amateurs. I'll need time to crack his systems." "You've got 24 hours," I said, my tone firm. "I'm hitting his main hub tomorrow night." Elena chuckled. "You haven't changed a bit." "All right, I'll see what I can do. But Carver, be careful. This guy's not playing around." "Neither am I said, my voice cold. By the next evening, Elena had come through. She'd hacked into Snake's network, providing me with detailed schematics of his main hub, a fortified compound on the outskirts of town. It was a fortress with armed guards, surveillance cameras, and a state-of-the-art security system. But Elena had found a weakness, a blind spot in the camera coverage near the back entrance. I spent the day preparing, gathering the tools and weapons I'd need for the mission. Reyes and Mac were already in position, ready to provide backup if things went south. But this was my fight, and I intended to finish it alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I made my way to the compound, my movements silent and precise. The blind spot was exactly where Elena had said it would be, and I slipped through the fence without triggering any alarms. The compound was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of machinery in the distance. I moved quickly, my senses on, High alert. The guards were well trained, but they were complacent, relying too much on their technology. I took them out one by one, my knife flashing in the dark. By the time I reached the main building, the perimeter was clear. Inside, the compound was a maze of corridors and rooms, each one more heavily guarded than the last. I moved like a shadow, my footsteps silent, my breathing steady. The memories of my Delta Force days came flooding back. The adrenaline, the focus, the sheer determination to complete the mission. Finally, I reached the heart of the compound, a large, dimly lit room filled with monitors and computers. Snake was there, standing in the center of the room, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Carver," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really think you can take me down? You're just one man." I stepped into the light, my eyes locked on his. "I'm not just one man," I said, my voice cold. "And this isn't just about you." Snake's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Then he reached for the gun at his side. But he was too slow. I fired twice, the silenced shots echoing through the room. Snake crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. I stood over him, my chest heaving, my hands steady. "This is for Joe's Haven," I said, my voice low and deadly. "And for everyone you've hurt." Then I turned and ran, the sound of the explosives detonating behind me as the compound erupted in flames. The mansion loomed in the distance, a sprawling monstrosity of stone and steel nestled in the hills outside town. It was a fortress, every inch of it designed to repel intruders. High walls topped with razor wire, security cameras scanning every angle, and guards patrolling the grounds with military precision. Snake had turned his home into a stronghold, and breaking in wasn't going to be easy. I crouched in the tree line, binoculars pressed to my eyes, studying the layout. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. This was it, the turning point. Snake's empire was crumbling, and he knew it. But he wasn't going down without a fight. I'd spent the last 2 days planning this operation, gathering intel, and preparing for every possible scenario. Elena had hacked into Snake's security system, providing me with blueprints of the mansion and the locations of the guards. Reyes and Mac were on standby, ready to provide backup if things went south. But I knew Snake would be expecting a direct assault. I had to be smarter than that. I slipped back into the shadows, making my way to the delivery van I'd borrowed from a local courier service. The uniform I wore was a size too big, and the hat sat awkwardly on my head. But it would have to do. I loaded a crate onto a dolly, making sure it was filled with enough explosives to level the mansion if it came to that. Then I drove up to the gate, my heart steady despite the tension in the air. The guard at the gate was young, barely out of his teens, with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a bored expression on his face. He stepped forward as I rolled down the window, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the van. "Delivery for Mr. Snake," I said, my voice calm and professional. "Got a package that needs his signature." The guard frowned, glancing at the crate in the back. "Nobody told me about a delivery." I shrugged, forcing a smile. "Hey man, I just drive the truck. You want me to take it back? Or—" He hesitated, then nodded. "Wait here." He stepped away, speaking into his radio. I kept my hands on the wheel, my eyes scanning the compound. There were at least a dozen guards visible, and who knew how many more inside. Snake wasn't taking any chances. After a few tense moments, the guard returned. "All right, pull up to the main entrance. Someone will meet you there." I nodded, driving through the gate and up the long driveway to the mansion. The place was even more imposing up close, with its towering columns and heavy oak doors. I parked the van and stepped out, grabbing the dolly and rolling the crate toward the entrance. A man in a suit, Snake's personal assistant, by the looks of it, met me at the door. He was tall and lean, with cold eyes and a permanent scowl. "This way," he said, gesturing for me to follow. I wheeled the crate inside, my eyes darting around as I took in the layout. The mansion was a maze of hallways and rooms, each one more opulent than the last. But beneath the surface, I could see the signs of a man preparing for war. Security cameras in every corner, panic buttons on the walls, and the faint hum of a generator in the distance. The assistant led me to a large study where Snake was waiting. He was seated behind a massive oak desk, his fingers steepled as he watched me with a cold, calculating gaze. He looked older than I'd expected, his hair streaked with gray and his face lined with scars. But his eyes were sharp, and they didn't miss a thing. "Set it there," the assistant said, pointing to a spot near the desk. I nodded, wheeling the crate into position. As I bent down to open it, I felt Snake's eyes on me, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. "You're new," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't recognize you." I forced a smile, keeping my tone light. "Just started last week. They've got me running all over the place." Snake didn't respond, his eyes narrowing as he watched me. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. I had to move fast. I opened the crate, revealing the contents. A stack of innocuous-looking boxes, but hidden beneath them were the explosives, carefully concealed and rigged to detonate remotely. I reached inside, pretending to fumble with the boxes, and activated the timer. 5 minutes. That was all I had. "Sign here," I said, holding out a clipboard and pen. Snake took them, his eyes never leaving mine. He scribbled his signature and handed them back, his expression unreadable. "You're dismissed." I nodded, wheeling the dolly back toward the door. But as I reached the threshold, I heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "Stop," Snake said, his voice cold and deadly. "Turn around." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned to face him. He was standing now, a pistol in his hand, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think I'm stupid?" he snarled. "You think I wouldn't recognize you, Carver? You've been a thorn in my side for weeks. Did you really think you could walk in here and walk out alive?" I didn't respond, my mind racing. The timer was ticking down, and I had to get out of there. But Snake wasn't going to let me go without a fight. He raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Any last words?" I smiled, my voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "Yeah, you should have paid more attention to the crate." His eyes widened as he realized what I meant, but it was too late. I dove to the side as the first explosion rocked the mansion, the force of the blast sending me sprawling. The room erupted in chaos, flames and debris filling the air as the explosives detonated. I scrambled to my feet, my ears ringing, and bolted for the door. The mansion was in shambles, the walls crumbling and the ceiling collapsing. I could hear shouts and screams as Snake's men tried to regain control, but I didn't stop. I had to get out of there. As I reached the front door, I felt a hand grab my arm, yanking me back. I turned, my fist connecting with the face of one of Snake's men. He staggered, and I followed up with a kick to his chest, sending him crashing into the wall. But more were coming, their guns drawn and their faces twisted with rage. I fought like a man possessed, my movements sharp and precise. Every punch, every kick, every strike was fueled by the memories of everything Snake had taken from me. My diner, my peace, my life. But I was outnumbered, and I knew it. Just as I was about to be overwhelmed, a voice cut through the chaos. "Carver, move!" I turned to see Reyes and Max standing in the doorway, their weapons drawn. They opened fire, cutting down Snake's men with ruthless efficiency. I didn't hesitate, bolting toward them as the mansion continued to collapse around us. We made it outside just as the final explosion rocked the compound, the force of the blast knocking us off our feet. I lay on the ground, my chest heaving, my body aching from the fight. But I wasn't done yet. As I struggled to my feet, I noticed something on the ground. A piece of paper, singed but still legible. I picked it up, my heart sinking as I read. The words scrawled on it: "Come alone, or your friends pay the price." Beneath the message was a photo of Lisa and Sheriff Carter, bound and gagged, their faces filled with fear. The photo in my hands felt like a punch to the gut. Lisa and Carter, innocent people who had nothing to do with this, were now in Snake's crosshairs. He'd taken them to force my hand, and it had worked. I crumpled the paper in my fist, my jaw tightening as I stared at the burning ruins of the mansion. Snake was still alive. I could feel it in my bones. And now, he had the upper hand. Reyes and Mac approached, their faces grim. Reyes glanced at the photo in my hand and let out a low curse. "He's got them, doesn't he?" I nodded, my voice tight. "Yeah, and he wants me to come alone." Mac crossed his arms, his expression dark. "You're not seriously thinking about walking into a trap, are you? That's suicide." "I don't have a choice," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "This is my fight. I'm not letting anyone else get hurt because of me." Reyes stepped forward, his eyes hard. "You're not going alone. We're in this together. Carver, you don't get to play the hero and leave us behind." I shook my head, my voice firm. "No. Snake's expecting me to come with backup. If he sees you, he'll kill them. I can't risk it." Mac opened his mouth to argue, but Reyes held up a hand, silencing him. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "But we're not sitting this out. We'll be close. If things go south, we'll move in." I hesitated, then nodded. It was the best I could hope for. "All right, but stay out of sight. No matter what happens, don't intervene unless I give the signal." They agreed, though neither of them looked happy about it. We spent the next hour going over the plan, mapping out every possible scenario. Snake would be expecting me, and he'd have every advantage. But I had one thing he didn't: nothing left to lose. The location Snake had chosen for the final confrontation was an abandoned factory on the edge of town. It was a sprawling, rusted structure surrounded by chain-link fences and overgrown weeds. The perfect place for an ambush. I approached on foot, my movements slow and deliberate. The factory loomed ahead, its broken windows like empty eye sockets, staring into the night. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. As I reached the entrance, a voice crackled over a nearby speaker. "Welcome, Carver. I've been expecting you." I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the gun at my side. But I didn't draw it. "Not yet." "Where are they?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty lot. "Inside," Snake's voice replied, dripping with mockery. "Come and find them." I stepped through the doorway, my senses on high alert. The factory was a maze of rusted machinery and crumbling catwalks, the air thick with the smell of oil and decay. I moved slowly, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. Snake was here. I could feel it. The first trap was a tripwire, barely visible in the dim light. I spotted it just in time, stepping over it carefully. The second was a pressure plate hidden beneath a pile of debris. I avoided it, my heart pounding as I realized how close I'd come to setting it off. But the third trap was unavoidable. As I rounded a corner, a flashbang grenade rolled into view, its blinding light and deafening noise overwhelming my senses. I stumbled back, disoriented, as Snake's men emerged from the shadows, their guns trained on me. "Drop the weapon," one of them barked, his voice harsh and commanding. I hesitated, my hand tightening on the grip of my gun. But I knew I was outmatched. Slowly, I lowered the weapon to the ground and raised my hands. "Smart move," Snake said, stepping into view. He was flanked by two more men, their faces hard and their eyes cold. "You always were a quick learner, Carver. Too bad you didn't learn when to quit." I didn't respond, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of Lisa and Carter. They were here somewhere. I could feel it. Snake smirked, his eyes gleaming with malice. Looking for your friends? Don't worry, they're safe. For now. He gestured to one of his men, who stepped forward and grabbed my arms, forcing them behind my back. I didn't resist, letting them cuff me. This wasn't over. Not yet. Snake stepped closer, his face inches from mine. You've caused me a lot of trouble, Carver. But it ends tonight. You're going to pay for everything you've done. I met his gaze, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my gut. You're right. It does end tonight, but not the way you think. His smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Then he stepped back, his expression hardening. Take him to the others. The men dragged me through the factory, their grip tight and unyielding. We reached a large room at the back, where Lisa and Carter were tied to chairs, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. "Joe!" Lisa cried, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. We didn't know." "It's okay," I said, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. "I'm going to get you out of here." Snake laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed through the room. "You're in no position to make promises, Carver. But don't worry, I'll make this quick." He raised his gun, aiming it at Lisa. My heart stopped, my mind racing as I searched for a way out. But before he could pull the trigger, a voice cut through the silence. "Drop it, Snake." Reyes and Mac stepped into the room, their weapons trained on Snake and his men. I didn't know how they'd gotten in, and I didn't care. All that mattered was that they were here. Snake's eyes widened, his smirk fading as he realized he was outnumbered. "You think this changes anything?" He snarled, his voice filled with rage. "You're all dead." He fired, the shot ringing out as chaos erupted. I dove to the side, grabbing my gun from the floor and returning fire. The room was a blur of motion and noise, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. When the dust settled, Snake's men were down, and Snake himself was on the ground, clutching his side. I stepped forward, my gun trained on him, my chest heaving. "It's over," I said, my voice cold and final. Snake looked up at me, his eyes filled with hatred. "You think this changes anything?" He spat, his voice weak but defiant. "You're still a killer, Carver. You always will be." I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled the trigger, the shot echoing through the room. Snake's body went still, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. It was over. The sun rose over the town, casting a golden glow on the charred remains of Joe's Haven. The diner was gone, reduced to ash and rubble, but the town was alive with a newfound sense of hope. Snake's gang had been dismantled, their reign of terror brought to an end. The streets were quiet, the air filled with the sounds of birdsong and the distant hum of rebuilding. I stood in the shadow of what had once been my sanctuary, my hands stuffed into the pockets of my jacket. My shoulder ached where the bullet had grazed me, and my body was bruised and battered from the fight. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight in my chest. The diner was gone. The life I'd built was gone. And yet, as I looked around at the townsfolk, Lisa, Carter, Hank, and the others, I knew it had been worth it. Lisa approached me cautiously, her eyes red from crying but her face filled with relief. "Joe," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved us. You saved everyone." I shook my head, my voice quiet but firm. "I didn't do it for thanks, Lisa. I did it because it was the right thing to do." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "What happens now? Are you going to stay?" I hesitated, my gaze drifting to the horizon. The truth was, I didn't know. The town was safe, but my place here was gone. The diner had been more than just a building. It had been my anchor, my connection to the life I'd tried to build after leaving my past behind. Without it, I felt untethered. Adrift? I don't think so, I said finally, my voice heavy with regret. This town doesn't need me anymore, and I need to figure out what comes next. Lisa's face fell, but she didn't argue. She knew as well as I did that my time here was over. Instead, she reached out and squeezed my hand, her grip tight and reassuring. Whatever you do, Joe, just be safe and know that you'll always have a home here. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. Take care of yourself, kid, and take care of this place. The Haven was never about the building. It was about the people. Keep it alive. She smiled, through her tears, nodding as she let go of my hand. I will. I promise. I turned and walked away, my footsteps slow and deliberate. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I might not have the strength to leave. Later that day, I packed what little I had left into my truck. A few changes of clothes, my dog tags, the black notebook, and the photo of Anna. The rest I left behind, including an envelope filled with cash for Lisa. It was enough to rebuild the diner. To give her a fresh start, it was the least I could do. As I drove out of town, the sun setting behind me, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sadness, of course, and a sense of loss. But there was also a flicker of hope, a quiet determination to find a new purpose, a new fight. The townsfolk whispered stories about me as I left. The quiet man who had once been their savior. Some called me a hero. Others called me a ghost. But to me, I was just a man trying to make amends for the life I'd left behind. Somewhere, in a quiet corner of the world, I would find a new chapter. The fight for justice was far from over, and I wasn't ready to hang up my boots just yet. But for now, I would disappear, fading into the horizon like a shadow. As the town faded in my rearview mirror, I allowed myself a small smile. The Haven was gone, but its spirit lived on. In Lisa, in Carter, in the townsfolk who had called it home. And that was enough.